My mother never congratulated me on any achievement while worshipping my unemployed brother. She regrets everything after he destroyed her party. My mother has spent 30 years pretending I don't exist while worshipping my younger brother Jake. I graduated high school as valedictorian, and she told everyone Jake helped me study, even though he was failing sophomore year at the time. I got a full scholarship to engineering school, and she said it was probably a diversity quota they needed to fill. When I graduated magna cum laude, she didn't come to the ceremony because Jake had a football game where he sat on the bench the entire time. She took 300 photos of him in his uniform on the bench and posted them everywhere, talking about her athletic son. When I got my first job at an aerospace company, she told people I was doing basic data entry while Jake was finding himself. Jake was actually unemployed and living in her basement, playing video games all day. When I designed a component that went into satellites, she said it was probably a team effort where I got lucky to be included. When Jake got a part-time job at a sporting goods store, she threw him a party and made a cake that said, "So proud of my successful son." She'd call Jake every morning to wish him a good day at work. She'd never once called me at my actual career. I bought my first house at 26 and invited her to see it. She walked through once, said it was small, then spent 2 hours talking about how Jake was thinking about maybe looking at apartments someday. When Jake moved into a studio apartment at 30, still partially paid for by her, she hired a professional photographer to document the move and created a photo album called Jake's Independence Journey. On my wedding day, she wore black and told guests she was mourning the loss of her baby boy to some woman, meaning me getting married meant less time for Jake somehow. She gave a speech entirely about Jake's future wedding and how beautiful it would be. My wife was sitting right there in her wedding dress while my mother planned another wedding for her favorite son, who wasn't even dating anyone. When Jake brought home a girlfriend who lasted 3 weeks, my mother had already planned their entire future together, including grandchildren's names. When my wife actually got pregnant, my mother asked if we were sure we were ready for that responsibility. We were 32 with stable careers and a house. Jake was 35, still working retail, still taking money from her, but she said he'd be such a wonderful father someday. My son was born, and my mother visited once, held him for 5 minutes, said he looked nothing like our side of the family, then left to go to Jake's apartment because he was feeling lonely. When Jake's girlfriend's sister had a baby, my mother babysat every week and called herself surrogate grandma. She'd never once offered to babysit her actual grandchild. I got promoted to lead engineer on a government contract worth millions. My mother's response was to ask if that meant I'd have less time to help Jake with his resume. Jake hadn't updated his resume in 5 years. When Jake got promoted to shift supervisor at the sporting goods store, my mother rented a billboard. An actual billboard on the highway announcing Jake's promotion. It cost her $3,000. She'd never even acknowledged my promotions. The pattern continued for years. I'd achieve something, she'd ignore it or diminish it. Jake would do the bare minimum, she'd throw a parade. I started a consulting firm that grew to 12 employees. She told people I was playing with computers. Jake started a blog that got 40 views a month. She printed business cards calling him a published writer and handed them out at church. Then came her retirement party planning. She was retiring from her job as a school administrator and wanted a big celebration. She put Jake in charge of planning even though he'd never planned anything in his life. She told everyone Jake was organizing this amazing event for her. Jake forgot to book a venue, forgot to send invitations, and forgot to order food. 3 days before the party, he called me panicking. He wanted me to fix everything but not tell Mom because she'd be disappointed in him. I said no. He called me selfish and said I was ruining Mom's special day. The day of the party, about 15 people showed up to Mom's backyard because Jake had only remembered to text some people that morning. No decorations, no food except chips Jake bought at a gas station, no music because Jake forgot speakers. My mother stood there trying to smile while people awkwardly stood around, wondering what was happening. Then she saw my car pull up next door. I was having a celebration at my house for my company's 5th anniversary. I'd rented tents, hired catering, had a DJ, invited 60 people, including all my employees and their families. My mother could see everything from her backyard. The smell of professional barbecue drifted over. The music was perfectly audible. The laughter and celebration were obvious. She walked over and demanded that I combine the parties to save her embarrassment. I said this was a corporate event that had been planned for months. She said I'd deliberately scheduled it to upstage her. I showed her the emails from 3 months ago, proving the date was set long before she'd announced her retirement. She asked why I hadn't told her. I said she'd never asked about my business because she was too busy promoting Jake's non-existent writing career. Jake came over and tried to grab food from my catering table, saying it was for Mom's party. I stepped between Jake and the catering table. This was my company event, not his backup plan. He reached around me anyway, trying to grab a plate. I told the catering staff not to serve anyone from next door. Jake's face went red. He said Mom's guests were hungry, and I was being selfish, like always. The head caterer looked at me, waiting for direction. I repeated that this was a private corporate event. Jake started yelling about how I always thought I was better than him. His voice carried across both yards. People from my party turned to look. People from Mom's sad gathering in her backyard stopped their awkward standing around to watch. My wife appeared next to me. She told Jake calmly that he needed to leave our property. 3 of my employees moved closer, not threatening, but clearly backing me up. Jake looked around at them and his voice got louder. He said I'd always looked down on him, always had to show off how successful I was. I pointed out that he literally came over here to steal food because he forgot to order any for the party he was supposed to plan. Mom came storming across from her yard. She demanded to know why I was making a scene and embarrassing her in front of everyone. I stayed calm. I told her she was the one making a scene at someone else's event. Her party failed because Jake had weeks to plan it and forgot everything. She ignored that completely. She said I should have offered to help Jake since I was so good at planning things. The irony didn't even register on her face. She'd just admitted I was good at something while accusing me of not helping enough. My wife pulled out her phone and started recording. Mom kept going, listing all the ways I'd failed to support Jake over the years. How I never helped him with his resume. How I never was invited him to company events. How I focused on my own success instead of lifting up my family. The catering staff and my employees were all watching now. Mom's guests had moved closer to the fence between our yards. Everyone could hear everything. I asked her to name one achievement of mine she'd ever acknowledged. Just one. Right here in front of all these witnesses. She opened her mouth and nothing came out. She looked around at the people watching. She said I'd always been self-sufficient and didn't need her support like Jake did. That was her answer. That I didn't need her. 30 years of dismissing everything I accomplished, and her excuse was that I didn't need recognition. I asked if she understood what she just said. She looked confused. I told her that needing support and deserving recognition were 2 different things. She'd given Jake both while giving me neither. Alyssa Koch walked over from Mom's yard. She was one of Mom's oldest friends, someone who'd been around since I was a kid. She put her hand on Mom's arm gently. She told Mom that maybe she should look at what was actually happening here. The contrast between the 2 events was visible to everyone. My professionally catered celebration with 60 happy guests versus Mom's empty backyard with gas station chips and 15 uncomfortable people. Alyssa said she'd been worried about this dynamic for years, but never knew how to bring it up. Mom jerked her arm away. She accused Alyssa of taking sides against her. Alyssa didn't back down. She said real friends tell hard truths. Several of Mom's other guests were watching from her yard now. They looked uncomfortable. Some were whispering to each other. Mom's voice got shrill. She told Alyssa she didn't need this kind of friend. Alyssa said that was Mom's choice to make, but the favoritism was real, and everyone had seen it for years. Mom turned back to me. She said I was cruel and vindictive. I told her I was done pretending her favoritism didn't exist. I wouldn't be available for family events until she could acknowledge what she'd done. She started crying. She said I was abandoning her during her retirement celebration. I pointed out that Jake was supposed to give her that celebration. He'd failed completely. She'd put him in charge of the one thing that mattered to her, and he'd forgotten everything. That wasn't my fault. Jake jumped back in. He said I'd always been jealous of his relationship with Mom. I actually laughed. I asked him if he genuinely believed that, or if he was just scared of what happened when the safety net disappeared. He looked confused. I told him he was 35 years old and still taking monthly checks from Mom. Still having his car insurance paid, still getting bailed out every time he struggled. He said family was supposed to help each other. I said help was supposed to go both ways. I'd never gotten help. I'd never gotten recognition. I'd built everything myself while watching Mom throw parades for his part-time job. My wife touched my arm. She suggested we go back to our guests and let Mom's party continue as planned. She was right. This wasn't accomplishing anything. We turned and walked back toward our celebration. Behind us, I heard Mom crying. I heard some of her guests trying to comfort her. But I also heard Alyssa's voice clearer than the others, saying that maybe this needed to happen. That sometimes people needed to hear hard truths before they could change. The music from my party started up again. The DJ had paused it during the confrontation. Now the sound of celebration filled the air again, drifting over to Mom's quiet, failed gathering next door. The party kept going behind me. I heard the DJ start the music back up. People laughed and talked like nothing happened. My employees and their families went back to eating and celebrating. But I couldn't shake what just happened. I stood near the catering table watching Mom's yard next door. Her guests were leaving. Most of them looked uncomfortable. They hugged her quickly and walked to their cars. Jake stood by himself near the gas station chip bags. He kept looking over at my party. Mom sat in a lawn chair with her face in her hands. Alyssa sat next to her talking quietly. I felt someone touch my shoulder. Evan stood there holding 2 bottles of water. He handed me one. We walked away from the crowd toward the side of my house where it was quieter. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there looking at Mom's empty yard. Then he told me he was proud of how I handled everything. I started to brush it off, but he stopped me. He said setting boundaries with family was one of the hardest things anyone could do. Most people spent their whole lives avoiding it because confrontation felt worse than the pain of being dismissed. He told me his dad cut off his own brother for 10 years over something similar. His uncle always borrowed money and never paid it back. Always had excuses, always made his dad feel guilty for not helping more. Finally, his dad said no more. The family called him selfish, said he was abandoning his brother. But his dad held firm, and eventually his uncle had to figure things out on his own. They reconnected years later, and the relationship was better because it had real boundaries. I asked if his uncle ever apologized. Evan shook his head. He said some people never apologize, but they do change their behavior when they realize the old patterns don't work anymore. We walked back to the party. My wife found me near the tent. She squeezed my hand and asked if I was okay. I nodded. The party went until almost 8. People thanked me for hosting. My employees talked about how much the company had grown, how proud they were to work there. Several of them mentioned they'd seen what happened with Mom. They didn't bring it up directly, but I could tell they understood. After everyone left, the catering staff cleaned up. The DJ packed his equipment. My wife and I sat in our backyard in the same chairs where we'd planned this party 3 months ago. The tents were still up. String lights hung between the poles. It looked pretty in the evening light. My wife said she needed to tell me something. She'd watched Mom dismiss me for 8 years, since before we got married. She'd seen it at family dinners and holidays and birthday parties. She'd watched me try to get Mom's attention with my achievements and watched Mom change the subject to Jake. She'd listened to me make excuses for it, saying Mom was just worried about Jake, saying it didn't bother me that much. But she could see it did bother me. She could see the hurt every time Mom ignored something important I'd done. She said she was relieved I finally said something directly instead of just absorbing it. I told her I didn't know if it would change anything. She said maybe it wouldn't. But at least I'd stopped pretending it was okay. At least I'd named what was happening out loud where other people could hear it. That mattered even if Mom never acknowledged it. We sat there until it got dark. Neither of us mentioned going over to check on Mom. The next morning I woke up to my phone buzzing constantly. 17 text messages. I opened them while still in bed. My wife was in the shower. Most of the messages were from Mom's side of the family. Cousins I barely talked to, Mom's friends from church, all asking what was wrong with me. Why would I embarrass Mom like that on her retirement day? Why would I be so cruel when she'd done so much for me and Jake? One cousin said I should be ashamed. Another said I always thought I was better than everyone. Mom's friend from book club said she was praying for me to find kindness in my heart. I deleted those messages. Then I saw one from Jacqueline, Mom's younger sister. The message said it was about time someone called this out. She asked if I wanted to talk. I texted back yes. She called an hour later. I was in my home office. My wife brought me coffee and closed the door to give me privacy. Jacqueline started by saying she should have said something years ago. She'd watched the favoritism my entire life. She remembered my high school graduation. Mom spent the whole ceremony talking about Jake's upcoming freshman year, about how excited she was for him to start high school, about how she hoped he'd do better than his sophomore slump. Jacqueline sat next to her trying to redirect the conversation to me, to my valedictorian speech. But Mom kept going back to Jake. When I walked across the stage, Mom was looking at her phone. Jacqueline saw it. Mom was texting Jake about what time to pick him up from his friend's house. I didn't remember that detail. I'd blocked out most of that day. Jacqueline said there were dozens of examples like that. My college graduation where Mom left early because Jake had a dentist appointment. My wedding where Mom cried through the whole ceremony but not happy tears. She told Jacqueline she was losing her baby boy. Jacqueline asked which son she meant. Mom said Jake, of course, that he'd be so lonely without his brother around as much. I asked Jacqueline why she never said anything. There was a long pause. Then she admitted Mom got defensive when confronted. Would cut people off completely if they pushed too hard. Jacqueline had tried once years ago to point out the difference in how Mom treated us. Mom didn't talk to her for 6 months, so Jacqueline learned to just avoid the topic. She felt guilty about it, but she didn't want to lose her relationship with her sister. I told her I understood. It wasn't her responsibility to fix Mom's behavior. She thanked me for saying that. Then she said the whole family had enabled this by staying quiet, by pretending not to notice, by making excuses for Mom. She said she was done with that. If Mom asked, Jacqueline would tell her the truth about what she'd observed. 3 days passed. Mom didn't call or text. Jake didn't either. I focused on work. We had a project deadline coming up. But Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang. Jake's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer. Then I did. He asked if I could lend him money. Just for this month. Maybe next month, too. Mom was too upset to help him right now, and his rent was due. I sat there stunned. I asked if he seriously thought I'd give him money after everything that happened. He sounded confused. He said family helps family. That's what family does. Mom always said I was good with money, that I knew how to manage finances. So obviously I could help him out. I realized he was completely serious. He genuinely didn't understand why I was angry. He was so deep in the dysfunction that he couldn't see how one-sided this was, how transactional. I'd never asked him for anything. Never gotten anything from Mom. But he expected me to just hand over money because that's what he was used to. People giving him things without question. I told him no. He said he didn't understand why I was being like this. That Mom always said we were supposed to help each other. I hung up without responding. My wife found me sitting on the couch staring at my phone. She asked what happened, and I told her about Jake's call. She shook her head and said she wasn't surprised, that he'd been trained his whole life to expect things from me while giving nothing back. 3 days later, my phone rang again. Mom's name on the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. She started talking immediately about how she'd been thinking about everything, how she wanted to explain her side. I stopped her and asked if she was calling to apologize or just to make me feel guilty. There was silence. Then she said she didn't know what I wanted her to apologize for, that she'd always loved both her children equally. The words hit me like a slap. I actually had to put the phone down for a moment and just breathe. My wife looked at me concerned, but I held up a hand. I picked the phone back up and told Mom that love and attention are not the same thing, that I could list hundreds of examples of her dismissing my achievements while celebrating Jake's mediocrity. She made a sound like she was about to cry, said I was being dramatic, that I was remembering things wrong because I was upset. My wife stood up and held out her hand for the phone. I gave it to her. She told Mom that she'd witnessed this treatment firsthand for 8 years. That gaslighting me about my own memories was exactly the problem. Mom's voice got sharp. She said she couldn't believe my wife would speak to her that way. My wife started to respond, but the line went dead. Mom had hung up. 2 weeks passed. No calls, no texts, nothing. I threw myself into work and tried not to think about it. Then Jacqueline called. She said Mom was telling everyone I'd turned my wife against the family, that I was poisoning my marriage with lies about favoritism. Jacqueline's voice was firm when she told me not to worry, that she was correcting that story whenever she heard it, explaining what actually happened at the party, what she'd witnessed over the years. I thanked her and she said she should have spoken up sooner, that staying silent had made her part of the problem. The next afternoon, I got a text from Alyssa Koch, Mom's friend from the party. She asked if she could meet me for coffee. I agreed mostly out of curiosity. We met at a place downtown 2 days later. She ordered a latte and I got black coffee. She didn't waste time with small talk, said she'd known Mom since college, that she'd watched the Jake favoritism get worse over the years, especially after my father died when I was 12. I sat back in my chair, asked what she meant by especially after. Alyssa stirred her latte slowly. She said Mom seemed to transfer all her emotional needs onto Jake after losing my father, started treating him like a surrogate emotional partner rather than a son. I was already independent and achieving things, so she didn't worry about me. But Jake's struggles made her feel needed, made her feel important. The realization hit hard. It explained the pattern, but it didn't excuse it. I said that out loud and Alyssa nodded. She agreed completely. Said understanding the cause doesn't mean I have to accept the behavior. That Mom needs professional help to recognize what she's done, to understand how she's damaged both her sons in different ways. I asked if Alyssa would be willing to talk to Mom about this. She sighed and said she'd already tried multiple times over the years. That Mom shuts down the conversation every time, changes the subject or gets defensive. Alyssa thought Mom would need to hear it from multiple people before she'd even consider that she might be wrong. I drove back to the office feeling heavy. My company had a major project deadline approaching, and I was struggling to focus. Numbers blurred on my screen. Emails sat unread. Ronan Williams knocked on my office door around 3, asked if everything was okay. I looked at him and something in his expression made me tell him. I gave him a brief overview of the family situation, the party, the confrontation, the phone calls. He listened without interrupting. Then he sat down in the chair across from my desk. Said he'd cut off his own parents 5 years ago due to similar favoritism toward his sister. That setting that boundary was the best decision he ever made for his mental health. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Warned me that family would pressure me to reconcile before Mom had actually changed, that they'd want me to restore comfortable dysfunction rather than demand real growth. I asked how he handled that pressure. He said he stopped explaining himself, stopped defending his decision, just repeated that he was open to reconciliation when real change happened, and left it at that. The conversation with Ronan stuck with me as I drove home that evening. His words about family pressure kept playing in my head. I pulled into my driveway and sat there for a minute, staring at the steering wheel. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I opened it and saw Jake's name at the bottom. He'd gotten my work number from Mom, apparently. The message asked if we could talk. I didn't respond right away. I went inside and found my wife in the kitchen making dinner. She took one look at my face and asked what happened. I told her about Ronan's story and Jake's text. She wiped her hands on a towel and said maybe talking to Jake wasn't a bad idea, but I should set clear boundaries first. I texted back that he could come to my office tomorrow during lunch. He responded immediately with a thumbs-up emoji. The next morning, I got to work early and told the receptionist that my brother might stop by around noon. She looked surprised and said she didn't know I had a brother. I realized Jake had never visited my office in the 5 years since I'd started the company. He'd never seen where I worked or what I actually did all day. Mom had been to the office exactly once for about 10 minutes and spent the whole time on the phone with Jake about his shift schedule. At 11:30, the receptionist buzzed my desk and said Jake was here. I walked out to the lobby and found him standing there looking uncomfortable in jeans and his sporting goods store polo shirt. He'd clearly come straight from work. I led him back to a conference room and closed the door. He sat down and immediately his face crumpled. He started crying before I could even say anything. His shoulders shook and he put his head in his hands. I grabbed a box of tissues from the credenza and pushed it across the table. He took several and wiped his face, but the tears kept coming. He said everything was falling apart. Mom wasn't answering his calls. His rent was due in a week. His car was making a weird noise he couldn't afford to fix. He didn't know what to do. I sat there watching him fall apart and felt this weird mix of feelings. Part of me wanted to help because he was my brother, and he was clearly struggling. But another part of me was angry that he was 35 years old and completely unable to handle basic adult problems. I asked him how much money he made at the store. He told me about $1,400 a month after taxes. I asked about his expenses. He started listing them and I grabbed a notepad to write everything down. Rent was $800. His car payment was $250. Insurance was another $100. Phone bill was $80. He stopped there and looked at me. I asked about food and gas and other basic stuff. He got quiet. Then he admitted that Mom had been giving him money every month to cover those things. I asked how much. He said it varied, but usually around $1,500. I put my pen down and stared at him. That was more than his entire paycheck from the store. He'd been living almost entirely on Mom's money for years. I asked how long this had been going on. He looked at the table and said about 10 years, maybe longer. He'd never really kept track. My mind was spinning. 10 years of $1,500 a month was $180,000. Mom had given him nearly $200,000 while telling everyone I was selfish for not helping him more. I asked if she paid for anything else. He nodded and said she covered his car insurance and phone bill directly. Those were in her name. He'd never had to pay them himself. I leaned back in my chair and tried to process this. Jake had never actually supported himself, not once in his entire adult life. The sporting goods job was basically just something to do during the day. It didn't actually fund his life. Mom did that. I told him he needed to learn to live on what he earned. He looked panicked and said he couldn't. The numbers didn't work. His rent alone was more than half his paycheck. I said then he needed to find a cheaper place or get a better job or both. He started crying again and said he couldn't handle this. I felt my frustration building, but I tried to keep my voice steady. I told him I'd help him figure out a budget and look at his options, but only if he could acknowledge something first. He looked up at me with red eyes. I said he needed to admit that Mom's favoritism was real and that it had been harmful. Not just to me, but to him too. He was 35 and completely unable to function as an independent adult because she'd enabled him his whole life. He started to argue and said Mom just paid more attention to him because I was always busy with my own stuff. He thought I preferred it that way since I never seemed to need help. I stood up and walked to the window. I looked out at the parking lot and took a deep breath. Then I turned around and told him the truth. I was busy because I had to be. Nobody was going to pay my rent or my car payment or my phone bill. I had to build a career and a life completely on my own because there was no safety net for me. He got to coast because Mom treated his problems as more important than my achievements. She threw him parties for getting a part-time job while ignoring my engineering degree. She rented a billboard for his shift supervisor promotion while never acknowledging my government contracts. I asked him if he'd ever once thought about why that might hurt me. He looked genuinely troubled, like this framing had never occurred to him before. He said he just thought I didn't care about that stuff because I was so focused on my career. I sat back down and pulled my chair closer to the table. I told him that I cared deeply. Every time Mom dismissed something I'd worked hard for, it hurt. Every time she celebrated his bare minimum effort while ignoring my actual success, it made me feel invisible. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he was sorry. He'd never thought about it from my perspective. He'd just been focused on his own struggles and grateful that Mom was there to help. I nodded and said I understood that, but it didn't change the fact that the dynamic was messed up. We spent the next 2 hours going through his finances in detail. I had him pull up his bank statements on his phone. We looked at every expense and every deposit. The pattern was clear. Mom's transfers came in like clockwork on the first of every month. $1,500, sometimes more if he'd mentioned needing something specific. His paychecks from the store barely registered compared to her support. I showed him what his actual income was versus his expenses. The gap was obvious. He couldn't afford his current lifestyle on his own, not even close. I suggested he start by finding a roommate to split rent. He could probably cut his housing cost in half. He looked horrified at the idea of having a roommate at 35, but I pointed out that lots of people his age had roommates. It wasn't shameful, it was practical. He asked what else he could do. I said he needed to look for better paying work. Retail management positions at bigger stores paid more, or he could look into completely different fields. He had a college degree he'd never really used. He'd studied communications and then just never applied it to anything. He said he'd tried looking for other jobs before, but nothing ever worked out. I asked how hard he'd actually tried. He admitted he'd sent out a few resumes years ago, but gave up when he didn't hear back immediately. I told him job hunting took persistence. You had to apply to dozens of places and follow up and keep trying. He'd given up after like 5 applications. We talked about his car payment next. I asked why he was paying $250 a month. He said Mom had helped him buy the car 2 years ago and that was the payment. I asked what kind of car. He said a new SUV. I put my head in my hands. He was driving a brand new SUV while working part-time retail and living off Mom's money. It was absurd. I told him he needed to sell the SUV and buy something used that he owned outright. The car payment was killing his budget. He protested that he needed reliable transportation for work. I said a 10-year-old sedan was plenty reliable and wouldn't cost him $250 a month plus insurance. By the end of our 2 hours, I'd sketched out a realistic budget for him. Cheaper apartment with a roommate, used car with no payment, basic phone plan instead of unlimited everything. He could actually live on his store income if he made these changes. But he looked terrified. He kept saying he didn't know if he could do it. I told him he didn't have a choice. Mom wasn't going to keep funding him forever, especially not after what happened at the party. He needed to figure out how to be independent before the money stopped completely. He asked if I thought Mom would really cut him off. I said I didn't know, but he couldn't count on her support anymore. She was retired now. She had her own expenses. He needed to plan for supporting himself. He left my office looking shell-shocked. I watched him walk to his SUV in the parking lot and drive away. I felt drained. The next few weeks were quiet. Jake didn't call or text. Mom didn't reach out either. I focused on work and tried not to think about the family mess. Then 3 weeks after the party, my phone rang during a project meeting. It was Mom. I stepped out of the conference room to take the call. She sounded off. Her voice was tight and strained. She said she'd been having chest pains and needed someone to take her to the doctor. My first thought was to ask where Jake was. She went quiet for a second. Then she admitted she hadn't told him. She said he got too worried about medical stuff and she didn't want to stress him out. I felt anger flash through me. Even in a health crisis, she was protecting Jake from stress while expecting me to handle the actual problem. I told her she needed to call Jake first. If he couldn't help, then I'd consider it, but I wasn't going to keep being the reliable backup she never acknowledged. She was stunned. She started crying and said she never realized I felt this way. I reminded her that I'd literally told her this at the party 2 weeks ago, and she'd called me dramatic. Her sudden realization felt awfully convenient given that she needed something from me right now. She kept crying and saying she was scared and didn't know what to do. I felt my resolve weakening, but I held firm. I told her to call Jake and tell him what was happening. She said okay in this small voice and hung up. I stood in the hallway staring at my phone. My wife called 5 minutes later. Mom had called her. I could hear Mom crying in the background. My wife said we should take her to the doctor because it was a health issue and that was the right thing to do, but she made it clear this didn't mean the larger problems were resolved. I heard my wife tell Mom this directly. Mom agreed, sounding small and scared in a way I'd never heard before. I drove Mom to the medical center with my wife in the back seat. The building was gray concrete with those big glass doors that always felt too heavy. Mom walked slowly through the parking lot, one hand pressed against her chest like she was holding something in place. The receptionist checked her in, and we sat in the waiting room with its mint green walls and magazines nobody ever read. Mom kept her purse clutched in her lap and stared at the fish tank in the corner. After 20 minutes, a nurse called her name, and we followed her down a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and floor polish. The exam room was small with a paper-covered table and posters about heart health on the walls. The doctor came in 15 minutes later, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain. She reviewed the test results on her computer screen and told Mom the chest pains were anxiety-related, not cardiac. Mom's shoulders dropped with relief. The doctor asked about recent stress in her life, and Mom immediately started talking about her retirement party. She described how she'd been looking forward to this celebration for months, and how her oldest son had scheduled a competing event right next door on the same day. She said I'd rented tents and hired catering and invited dozens of people, all to deliberately upstage her special moment. She said the stress of being humiliated in front of her friends and neighbors had been overwhelming. The doctor nodded and took notes while Mom painted this picture of me as some vindictive son who'd plotted to ruin her retirement. I sat there listening to her rewrite what actually happened and felt my jaw tighten. When Mom paused for breath, I spoke up and corrected the story. I explained that my company event had been planned 3 months in advance with dated emails to prove it. I told the doctor about Jake forgetting to book a venue or order food or send invitations. I mentioned the 30 years of favoritism where Mom celebrated Jake's retail job with a highway billboard but never acknowledged my government contracts. I described how she'd called Jake every morning about his part-time work but never once called me about my actual career. Mom's face went red and she stared at her hands while I laid out the pattern for the doctor. The doctor stopped writing and looked between us with this knowing expression. She said family dynamics often showed up as physical symptoms and that unresolved stress could definitely cause chest pain. Mom tried to interrupt, but the doctor kept talking. She said Mom might benefit from speaking with someone about family stress and retirement adjustment. Mom dismissed this immediately and said she just needed some medication for the anxiety. The doctor was firm and said anxiety this severe needed to be addressed, not just medicated. She wrote a prescription, but also gave Mom a referral to a therapist and said she strongly recommended following up. Mom took both papers and folded them into her purse without looking at them. We walked back to the car in silence. Mom got in the front seat and stared straight ahead while I started the engine. My wife sat in back and didn't say anything either. I pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward Mom's house. 10 minutes into the drive, Mom suddenly asked why I never told her I was unhappy. Her voice was quiet and confused, like she genuinely didn't understand. I reminded her about the conversation at my wedding 8 years ago when I'd asked why she wore black. I reminded her about the dinner 3 years ago when I'd brought up how she never acknowledged my promotions. I reminded her about the time 5 years ago when I'd asked why she never wanted to babysit her actual grandchild. Each time I'd tried to bring it up, she'd either changed the subject or told me I was being too sensitive. Mom insisted she didn't remember any of those conversations. She sounded almost panicked about it, like I was making things up. My wife leaned forward from the back seat and said she'd been there for at least 3 of those conversations. She confirmed that Mom had shut down the discussion every single time. She said she'd watched Mom redirect to talking about Jake whenever I tried to express how the favoritism made me feel. Mom went quiet again, and I realized something that made my chest hurt. She genuinely blocked those conversations out because remembering them would mean admitting she'd failed me. It was easier to forget than to face what she'd done. I pulled up to a red light and looked over at her. I told her I loved her, but I couldn't keep having a relationship where my feelings got erased. She needed to actually work on recognizing the favoritism and changing the pattern, not just wait for me to get over being upset. Mom asked what I wanted her to do, and her voice cracked on the last word. I told her to start by calling Jake and telling him about her doctor's appointment instead of hiding it from him. She needed to stop protecting him from reality and treating me like the only competent one while never acknowledging that competence. She needed to stop expecting me to be the reliable backup who fixed everything while Jake got all the celebration for doing nothing. Mom nodded slowly and wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse. I drove the rest of the way to her house and walked her to the door. She went inside without saying anything else, and I stood on her porch for a minute before going back to the car. My wife squeezed my shoulder when I got in and we drove home. 4 weeks after the party, Jacqueline called and asked if we'd come to dinner at her house. She said she was inviting Mom and Jake too, and wanted to talk through things with everyone present. She positioned it as a chance to have a real conversation with a neutral family member there who cared about all of us. I agreed, even though my stomach twisted at the thought of sitting at a table with Mom and Jake. The dinner was on a Saturday evening, and we arrived at Jacqueline's house at 6. She lived in a ranch-style home with a big dining room table that could seat 8 people. Mom was already there, sitting in one of the chairs with her hands folded. Jake showed up 10 minutes later looking nervous. Jacqueline served pot roast and mashed potatoes, and we all sat down. Nobody said much at first. Everyone was careful about what they talked about, like we were walking through a room full of broken glass. Jacqueline finally put down her fork and said she'd watched this dynamic play out for decades. She said both of her nephews had been hurt by it in different ways. I'd been hurt through constant dismissal, and Jake had been hurt through being enabled into helplessness. Mom's face went tight and she started to argue, but Jacqueline didn't back down. She listed specific examples in this calm, steady voice. The billboard for Jake's shift supervisor promotion versus no acknowledgement of my government contract. The professional photographer for Jake's studio apartment versus the single visit to my first house when I was 26. The album with Jake's studio photos that cost her almost $2,000. The 5-minute hospital visit after my son was born versus the weekly babysitting for a girlfriend's sister's baby. Jake shifted in his chair and his fork scraped against the plate. His face got red, and he looked down at the pot roast like it was the most interesting thing in the room. Jacqueline kept going and listed the billboard on the highway for his shift supervisor job, while my government contract didn't even get a phone call. Jake put his fork down and his hands went flat on the table. He said he didn't ask for any of that stuff. His voice came out quiet and defensive at the same time. Jacqueline looked at him with this gentle expression that somehow made her next words hit harder. She pointed out that he accepted everything without question and never once suggested Mom should acknowledge me equally. Not once in 30 years. Jake didn't have an answer for that, and the silence stretched out until I could hear the clock ticking on Jacqueline's wall. I told Jake I didn't blame him for Mom's behavior because she made those choices on her own. But I did hold him responsible for benefiting from it all this time without ever standing up for me. He could have said something at any point. He could have told Mom it wasn't fair. He could have refused some of the money or the attention or the celebrations. Jake's shoulders slumped, and he admitted he was scared that if he questioned anything, Mom might stop helping him. The words came out barely above a whisper. I nodded because that was exactly the problem at the center of everything. The love was conditional, and Jake knew it deep down, even if he'd never said it out loud before. Mom's love came with strings attached and requirements, and Jake had to keep struggling to keep receiving it, while I had to keep achieving to get nothing. Mom started crying and pulled a tissue from her purse. She said she never meant to hurt me, and her voice broke on the words. She just worried about Jake more because he struggled while I always succeeded at everything. I leaned forward and told her I succeeded because I had no choice in the matter. There was no safety net for me, so I had to build my own stability from nothing. Every achievement she dismissed was something I accomplished alone without help or encouragement or even basic acknowledgement. Jake had cushions everywhere to catch him, but I was walking a tightrope with no net, and she acted like that was easy. Jacqueline asked Mom if she could see how unfair that was. How treating one child's struggles as more important than the other child's achievements created anger and damaged both relationships. Not just mine with Mom, but also mine with Jake. Mom nodded slowly and wiped her eyes with the tissue. Her mascara left dark smudges under her eyes. For the first time, she seemed to actually understand instead of just defending herself or making excuses. She wasn't arguing back or trying to rewrite history. She just sat there nodding and crying. Mom said she was sorry, but it came out hesitant and incomplete, like she was testing the words. I told her I appreciated the apology, but words needed to be backed up by changed behavior over time. Not just this one conversation where she felt cornered by Jacqueline laying out decades of proof. She needed to actually work on treating us differently going forward. Mom nodded again and stared at her plate. Jake surprised everyone by speaking up and saying he wanted to try being actually independent without Mom's monthly money. Mom's head snapped up and she immediately protested that he couldn't afford it. Her voice got loud and panicked. Jake pointed out that this reaction was exactly the problem. She didn't believe he was capable of managing without her. She'd never given him the chance to find out if he could do it on his own. My wife spoke up for the first time since we sat down. She suggested that maybe Jake could benefit from the same kind of budget planning I'd offered him before. She added that our company was actually hiring for an entry-level operations position that paid better than retail. Jake looked interested but also scared, like he was standing at the edge of a cliff. I told him the offer stood if he wanted to apply properly through our normal process. I wouldn't give him special treatment, but I also wouldn't hold the family stuff against him if he was serious about the job. 2 months went by after that dinner, and Jake actually followed through. He showed up at my company office in a button-down shirt I'd never seen him wear before. He filled out an application, and Ronan handled the interview to keep everything professional. I stayed completely out of it, and didn't ask Ronan any questions about how it went. A week later, Ronan told me Jake got the job based on his own merit for the role. He had retail management experience and good references from his current supervisor, even if the job itself wasn't impressive. I called Jake that evening and told him he got the position, but that he'd be held to the same standards as any employee. No special treatment, and no safety net. He thanked me 3 times in a row and his voice shook. Mom called less frequently after that, but when she did call, she asked about my work projects. She wanted to know about the satellite component design I was leading and actually listened to the answers without changing the subject to Jake. It was awkward and clearly took effort for her. She'd pause like she was reminding herself to stay focused on what I was saying, but it was more attention than she'd paid to my career in 30 years, so I tried to appreciate the attempt. Jake struggled during his first month at the company. He showed up late twice in the first week, and Ronan had to have a serious conversation with him about professional expectations. Jake wasn't used to the structure or the accountability. At the sporting goods store, he could get away with things because Mom would call his manager if there were problems. Here, nobody cared about his excuses. Ronan mentored him patiently, though, and explained exactly what was expected and why it mattered. I watched from a distance as my brother experienced real consequences for the first time. He started carrying himself differently after a few weeks. His shoulders were back and he looked people in the eye during meetings. He asked questions when he didn't understand something instead of pretending he knew. The scared look faded and got replaced by something that looked like actual confidence instead of the fake version Mom had been building for him with her constant praise for nothing. 3 months passed and I got an invitation to my son's 4th birthday party that I'd organized weeks before. My wife handled most of the planning while I managed a project deadline at work. We set up the backyard with decorations and a bounce house and ordered a cake shaped like a dinosaur because that's what he was obsessed with lately. I invited the usual people, including extended family, and sent Mom an invitation not really expecting her to show up based on past history. The party started at 2 in the afternoon, and guests arrived with presents and kids ran around screaming in that way that makes parents tired just watching. Mom's car pulled into the driveway at 2:15, and I watched through the kitchen window as she got out carrying a wrapped box that actually looked like she'd put thought into it instead of grabbing something random at a store. She walked into the backyard, and my son ran up to her yelling about the bounce house, and she knelt down to his level and listened to him explain the entire plot of some dinosaur movie he'd watched 17 times. My wife squeezed my hand as we stood there watching Mom actually engage with our kid instead of doing her usual 5-minute appearance before leaving to check on Jake. She stayed for the whole party and helped serve cake and sang happy birthday and took photos with her grandson that she actually seemed present for instead of distracted. When she left 3 hours later, she hugged me and said she'd had a wonderful time and thanked us for including her. Alyssa showed up at my office 2 days later without calling first. My receptionist looked confused but sent her back to my office, and Alyssa sat down across from my desk, looking like she needed to tell me something important. She said Mom had been seeing a therapist for the past 6 weeks and had been talking about family patterns and the favoritism and how she'd damaged her relationship with me over decades. Alyssa had encouraged this after the doctor's visit when Mom's anxiety got diagnosed and the doctor suggested therapy. Mom hadn't mentioned any of this to me directly, but Alyssa thought I should know that the changes I'd been seeing weren't just temporary guilt, but actual work Mom was doing to understand her behavior. Alyssa said the therapist was helping Mom see how she'd used Jake to fill the emotional hole left by Dad's death, and how that had hurt both of her sons in different ways. I thanked Alyssa for telling me, and for being the kind of friend who pushed Mom toward help, instead of just enabling the dysfunction like everyone else had done for years. Jake called me on a Thursday evening sounding excited in a way I'd never heard from him before. He'd just gotten his first full paycheck from my company, and after he paid his rent and utilities and groceries and gas, he actually had money left over without needing Mom's monthly supplement. He kept saying he couldn't believe he'd done it, and his voice shook a little like he might cry. He admitted it was scary being actually independent for the first time at 35. But it also felt good in a way the retail job never had because he was building towards something real, instead of just collecting a paycheck while Mom covered the difference. He said Ronan had been teaching him about professional development and career planning, and he'd never realized work could be something you got better at, instead of just something you showed up for. I told him I was proud of him and meant it because watching him struggle through real accountability and come out the other side was worth more than any easy success Mom had tried to manufacture for him with her constant praise for nothing. 5 months after the retirement party disaster, my family gathered at Mom's house for a casual dinner that felt different from the start. Mom asked me about a new contract my company had just landed with an aerospace manufacturer and actually listened to my explanation of what the project involved instead of changing the subject to Jake after 30 seconds. Jake talked about a logistics project he was managing at work and the challenges he'd faced coordinating between departments, and Mom asked him follow-up questions that showed she understood he was doing real work. My wife and I exchanged looks across the table that said we were both feeling the same cautious hope about this shift in family dynamic. The relationship wasn't perfect, and probably never would be because you can't undo 30 years of damage with 5 months of therapy and effort. But there was finally room for me to exist in this family, as someone whose achievements mattered, instead of just the capable one who didn't need attention. Mom still favored Jake in small ways and probably always would because those patterns run deep. But she was trying, and that was more than she'd ever done before. Jake was building an actual life instead of floating through retail while Mom paid his bills. And I'd learned that I didn't need Mom's validation to know my worth because I'd built something real without her support. That was enough progress to keep trying.